My name is Alex Williams, founder of The New Stack, and you're listening to The New Stack podcast from Cloud Native Day, brought to you by Cisco. Check out Mantle, Cisco's open source microservices infrastructure, pulling together the best of open source projects, including Docker, Kubernetes, and Ansible. Learn more at mantle.io. That's MANTL.io. Hey, it's Alex Williams, The New Stack, here at Cloud Native Day in Toronto, Canada, and here with the RedHat crew. And so I thought I'd do a quick intro and then get started. So why don't we start with you, Jeremy?
Yeah, I'm Jeremy Eder from RedHat. I work in Performance and Scale Engineering Group. I'm currently working on scaling cloud-native technologies like Kubernetes and containers.
And I'm Diane Mueller. I'm the Director of Community Development working on OpenShift, which is running Kubernetes under the hood. So I'm very excited to be here at Cloud Native Day and working with Jeremy and Chris, my cohort here.
And I'm Chris Wright, Vice President, Chief Technologist at RedHat. And containers is an emerging technology, container orchestration, very important to RedHat and to our customers. So we're here excited to be talking about cloud-native applications today.
Great. So I thought I'd start by asking Jeremy about a project he's been working on that involves the new CNCF cluster that is out of SuperNAP in Las Vegas.
Yep.
And you wrote a blog post yesterday about scaling up, using this cluster with Kubernetes. And I'm curious tell us about that project and, and how you deployed it and how you're managing it now, what you're using it for.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and Intel for providing that resource. That's a great resource for the community, and I hope people feel that we've put it to good use and reuse it responsibly. Our goals were we had to put 1,000 nodes down, and more importantly than a control plane kind of distributed system management test, we wanted to fill that cluster with applications and objects that represented what customers might want to do on top of Kubernetes or OpenShift. And so we designed test harnesses and workload generators around that, which are all open source, of course. And so that's what I go into detail in the blog on how we developed kind of a flexible cluster loader framework that allows us to simulate a real-world scenario.
Huh.
One of the interesting things about that, and the great things about this cluster that CNCF has, and Intel is given all the hardware, and it's at Switch SuperNAP, so kudos to them for making that all available, is that they have 1,000 nodes available, but they only gave us 300. So not only did we wanted to get to 1,000, so we had to figure out creatively what we're going to do. So we deployed OpenStack, so that we could do the virtualization to get to 1,000 nodes of OpenShift running on this CNCF cluster. So it's actually a quite complex deployment that was going on over how many, the past 3 weeks, 4 weeks?
Yeah, at least 4 weeks, actually.
It's 4 weeks, and so what we've committed to is, and we showed all the warts and everything else in this blog post, which is great, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on the Cloud Native Day here. I think we have a presentation in the afternoon, but we're also going to go, now that we've done it on OpenStack, part 2 will be coming up, and we'll be trying to do the same thing with all 1,000.
Performance and scale engineering is an iterative process, and so what we've done so far is definitely a phase 1. We have a lot of ideas about what we'll do in phase 2, and we're going to expose as much as we possibly can about, give some feedback to the CNCF about the cluster itself, what would make it better, what would make it easier for people to get on and off, to allow for more flexible time sharing on their part, just stuff like that, And our end goal is to ensure that we sell a stable, or the RedHat is able to sell the most stable, scalable and performant cloud-native container orchestration platform possible. And this is the auspices of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is a perfect place for us to be able to exercise and show what we're capable of.
So Chris, what does cloud native orchestration mean to you now?
Well, cloud native is the way we're defining it within the CNCF is containerized applications put together using a microservices style architecture and using modern DevOps development and deployment methodologies to continuously develop, integrate, and deploy those components independently of one another, because they all have independent life cycles, but in aggregate continuing to perform a broad application functionality and scale on demand to the application load requirements, which will mean those independent services are scaling independent of one another.
So can you just then break that down a little bit and like how the CNCF views a containerized architecture?
Well, it starts with the container.
And what container would that be then?
Well, from a CNCF point of view, the container is just sort of an abstraction. The CNCF is really trying to leverage work that's happening in a different organization.
So it could be a Docker container.
Could be a Docker container, but really specifically we're trying to focus around industry understanding, adoption, and therefore some standardization. So we're working in parallel with or in concert with the OCI, which is trying to help standardize the container image format and runtime environment. So it's really based on a lot of the great work that Docker's done, and then trying to incorporate some other ideas from a few other projects. That becomes the building block, the base building block. The container hosts some application logic, which is not just logic, but also some runtime, like a Ruby or Node type of runtime, plus some base level dependencies. That unit is what's that's the container capturing some component, some service within the aggregate application. But an application is a broad set of services combined together, and so what's really important is not just the container itself, but how do you orchestrate delivering all this stuff? We've got a bunch of containers trying to deliver together in concert application level functionality, and that's kind of the challenge here, is helping people move to this new architectural design pattern in a way that is consumable to the enterprise.
So, Diane, and when you're thinking about kind of the scaling environments like that Jeremy is doing, and talk about containerized architectures such as Chris is discussing, the community management story becomes almost unprecedented, doesn't it?
It becomes quite complex.
Well, I mean, is there a precedent for this kind of scale in terms of
it is
a community?
It is indeed. I mean, I've talked to you before about this. I mean, it really requires a lot of cross-community collaboration, and that's
been difficult. I mean, there's internal issues inside OCI that are significant right now, and
those are
and in the Docker community as well is extremely
those are part of
complex.
Growing into a standardization. And I go back to the days of XML and people infighting around, what HTML is. I mean, Angel gave a talk about like the blinky cursor. I mean, this is all, I think, natural growing pains of how technology communities come to standards. We argue with each other, we discuss, we beta test, we position ourselves, and eventually a consensus will come out and a standard will there, and that's what the OCI is there to guide us with. From my perspective, is to bring these containerized platforms to the market takes more than a village. It takes massive amounts of coordination with upstream projects, not just the container community, but the Kubernetes, the orchestration, the monitoring communities, even the low-level etcd, and being able to make sure that we're all working in tandem. Because if you want to get something out there for people to use, you have to coordinate all of the release dates, the release cycles, for the pieces and parts that you need to get your project out the door as well. How's
the flow right now in terms of patches being resolved that Red Hat's contributing, or other companies are contributing to Docker, for example? How is that flow? How is that flow working right now? Are we seeing any impedance at all?
At the moment, not really. We've had some, technical difficulties and concerns in the past, but right now what we're seeing is, at least for OpenShift and OpenShift Origin, the project that I manage, which upstreams both Docker and Kubernetes and probably a half dozen other things as well, we're really very tightly tied to the Kubernetes release dates. So when the next release of Kubernetes comes out, we're within we're a publicly traded company, so I probably can't even say anything out loud. And Chris is
Right.
looking at me like, no, don't say. But like very shortly after that release, we're very closely tied to the Kubernetes release cycle. New releases of Docker and container stuff get patched into the releases. So we have to stay in very tight communication with everybody. And, the CNCF is really helping a lot, make sure that the release cycles and the roadmaps are in sync, and giving us guidance to keep that neutral, being a neutral host for the project for Kubernetes. So I think for us, I think OCI is doing a pretty good job of bringing people together around the standardization to help us make sure that the innovations that we want to put into things like Kubernetes and other projects get done. And I think the key is to figure out if we can maintain the velocity of release cycles that we have now and still have a solid project underneath us. So
Jeremy, that velocity in terms of your own requirements that you have, what is it that you are trying to figure out right now? In terms of, how these systems scale out, but also considering the velocity of development inside these different communities.
Yep. And it is definitely a challenge, and I've even commented just earlier this week that a lot of engineering jobs these days is reviewing patches and reviewing feature. Kubernetes has a feature sub-repository that people go to discuss what's coming down the pipe. And so, of course, we have to track all of that stuff. What I think, the community as a whole needs to double down on is performance and scale-related continuous integration of the cloud-native projects. And internally, we've got a lot of progress there and teams of people dedicated to working that stuff out. But I think we need to do more and push that to the next level and even the next level beyond that, in order to ensure that to the customers that they're getting something that's that's stable and that they can trust with their production workloads.
And that's an example of where the CNCF is trying to add value to the industry here. It's like, how do we take all these disparate projects, bring them together, provide some hardware environment to do not just functional testing, but some of that scale testing, so that the upstream projects themselves can ensure they're producing code that really scales to the needs of the industry, which is, you heard this morning here at Cloud Native Day, people deploying containers anywhere from tens to hundreds of thousands, so that you can get to really large scales. Right.
The world now is moving quickly to open source software, right? But we have, we were talking about this in the Pancake Breakfast today. There's lots of cloud service providers out there who, are using open source, but they're creating kind of a closed kind of community. For example, you can see that with any different service providers' API management platform, right? Some of them are more open than the others, but it can be difficult. For instance, if you're wanting to use an alternative service that inside AWS, for example, right? That makes for some very complex decision making for the actual customer. And a lot of customers out there are like trying to transition even from Unix, right? They're trying to move over into into this new world, really. I'm curious on what your outreach is out there to try to just kind of grow the community out there, because it seems like some of these problems could be resolved with a lot of new voices.
Well, I know one thing that we're tracking is when we talk to our customers, it's what is your strategy for where and how you're going to deploy your applications going forward. We understand really well where we are today, which includes a lot of things still running on bare metal. Our enterprise customers aren't 100% virtualized, so looking forward to containerization and next generation architectures is still very much a forward-looking activity. What we do hear consistently is most enterprises are looking at some blend of, we're putting things internally on our private hardware, whether it's a private cloud or virtualized data center, and externally on public clouds, but most are having a multi-cloud strategy. What that means from our point of view is we need to build a set of building blocks or abstractions that really allow these applications to move across all these different environments. And I think that's in part response to some of the history that people have had internally in their data centers and being worried about being locked into a single vendor. And you see the same in a public cloud, where the public cloud built from open source components, but then kind of proprietary specific implementations of each independent service creates that same concern for consumers of that technology, that it's a locked-in platform. It's hard to get, it's easy onboard, hard off-ramp. And so we're trying to help facilitate this really broad, we call it open hybrid cloud, but this broad strategy of how you can keep your applications moving and being deployed to the best location for your business.
And I guess thus then the importance of standard image formats and runtimes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Jeremy, what are some of the experiments you're doing across multi-cloud, and how are you approaching image formats and runtimes for consistency across multiple clouds?
Well, currently right now there is only really one choice for the base image format, and so what we've got is Docker. We're going to move wherever the industry needs us to move. If there's increasing momentum and around OCI, we will certainly begin to adopt that. I'm a little bit further down the pipeline than like functional testing and getting things up and running. We need some of the second day operations features of software in order to really do performance and scale testing on things. So we're currently still using Docker images. But I did want to bring one point up about multi-cloud stuff, and that's the work we've done in Kubernetes around persistent volumes. OpenShift or Kubernetes is now able to fully abstract the backend storage subsystems from the application developers. And so we can talk to Cinder, we can talk to Ceph, Gluster, EBS, GCE, all of those. And all the developer needs to do is ask for a certain amount of storage. Coming down the line, you'll be things like we can specify classes of storage, bronze, silver, gold, whatever concept you want, where you can say, oh, I need 1,000 IOPS, I need 10,000 IOPS, or this thing can be a glacier, nobody cares, because it's whatever, some nearline or backup device. And so that helps the developers, I call it a burden for OpenShift, but it's really the most proud part of it is that it can run on any cloud. And there's effort to make that occur, to make that possible, and there's trade-offs, of course. So persistent volumes is probably the best current example of how we can run on any cloud. And Red Hat has always been a partner-driven company, so we have plugins for the network stack as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the things that we're trying to do in the OpenShift community is do the education for the different approaches to deploying OpenShift and Kubernetes and doing the storage. And so in the thing that I run is the OpenShift Commons, and this topic of persistent storage and volumes was 2 weeks ago. We had a briefing on it, and there is really a fire hose of information that people have to keep up with. I mean, we saw in some of the earlier speeches here today is, Donnie Burkholtz's numbers of, people who are really deploying on cloud yet, who are using containers. People are still learning. Enterprises are still doing a lot of learning about this space and about using containers, but they're getting there. I think it was 30% of them had some sort of POC or pilot project going that was containerized applications in the cloud of some nature. And, as a community manager, and as someone who's working with all of these other, CNCF and OCI, one of our obligations is to make sure that the education and the content and the material is out there for people to make educated choices about how they do this. And that's, we do weekly briefings. We try and bring people together to do to network with their peers and that sort of work through the Commons. And this Cloud Native Day today is a good example of that. There'll be another one. KubeCon is be in Seattle. OpenShift will have a gathering there. So what we're really interested in doing is making sure that people are sharing their use cases and what they've learned, so they're not reinventing the wheel at different places. And so I think right now we're at this point where there's a lot of enthusiasm for cloud native applications, and there's a lot of innovation going on in different pockets, but what we really need to do is bring it all together and do the education so the enterprises can move forward effectively. And that's what the Cloud Native Foundation has done a really good job of so far, and providing a neutral host for some of these conversations to happen in.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to highlight, which is we spend a lot of time, in the industry and open source worlds. We're technology focused, and it's equally important to understand what problems you're solving, what use cases are important to customers, how to solve these problems, which include the outreach, the spread of information, sharing of best practices, understanding use cases, which they drive how we build the technology. But if you just think of it as a technology problem that we're solving by throwing component X, Y, or Z at the problem, we'll stay with these early adopters, and we'll never penetrate that broad reach, which is really what we're trying to aim for. Is some form of ubiquity.
One of the key takeaways from the use of that cluster was that we really need to expand the applicability of Kubernetes to additional workloads. From my perspective, it's all about the workloads. In fact,
what kind of workloads?
It could be high-performance compute. It could be animation, video rendering. It could be anything that works well in a batch format would be a prime candidate. I'd like to see stock exchanges run inside containers.
Yeah.
So those are the types of things that are maybe a little bit further out, but there's work going on right now to do this stuff, and I think that's Red Hat's traditional customer base. It makes perfect sense.
What release are we with OpenShift right now?
3.3, I think, and 3.4
is that compatible with Kubernetes 1.3?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay.
So we pretty much are in tandem with the Kubernetes release. We come out shortly after with the new release. A number of the OpenShift engineers and core contributors to OpenShift are also core contributors to Kubernetes as well. So there's a real close collaboration between the two communities.
What's coming up in Kubernetes 1.4 and even 1.5 that we'll see kind of manifested in OpenShift?
Well, that could be about a 2-hour talk, and I'm going to defer to another OpenShift Commons briefing that's coming up in 2 weeks. So if you go to OpenShift,
give us an idea here.
Yeah, there's a wish list that I have, but I don't have the details on the tip of my tongue.
What are some of then the themes then, Chris, that we should be looking for out of Kubernetes 1.4 and 1.5 that we'll see in OpenShift? And
I think you're looking at a group who's probably not best positioned to answer that question, but we can sort of throw some ideas out there. Continued focus on improving storage integration, so persistent storage matters. We're starting, and what that means for certain kind of use cases is the stateless, ephemeral, immutable image works well for a certain class of workloads, but we also have some requirements to maintain state.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you manage that? What is your selection process for where you place your workloads? And we're going to continue to need better integration, better support for networking, and expanding how you define your policy when you launch your application. I mean, these are kind of broad things. These are all the areas that are works in progress and continuous improvement in
that's
Kubernetes.
Perfect. That's perfect. Well, guys, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jeremy, Diane, Chris, have a great time at Cloud Native Day. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Oh, and we'll definitely see you at KubeCon in Seattle and Cloud Native Day there, and hopefully at the OpenShift gathering too.
Yep, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
You're listening to the New Stack podcast from Cloud Native Day, brought to you by Cisco. Check out Mantle, Cisco's open source microservices infrastructure, pulling together the best of open source projects, including Docker, Kubernetes, and Ansible. Learn more at mantle.io. That's MANTL.io.